Right. So welcome. This is the webinar on the Irvington Woods Community Forest Management Plan presentation. We have a distinguished panel here, of which I'll be adding a couple more people to the panel at least. But I'm Larry Shop from the Village Administrator, and we have CJ Riley, Peter Strom. I will have Joe Archino on the screen shortly. And most importantly, for this presentation, we have Miguel Barrios, who will take us through the Community Forest Management Plan this evening. And we'll be following that with questions and answers at the end, Miguel. Is that?
That's correct.
Yeah. So you'll be able to raise your hand and ask questions afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to Miguel.
Thanks a lot, Larry. I'm going to just stop my video quick and get the screen shared. And we're up and going here. All righty. So the Irvington Woods Inventory and Management Plan meeting. Here we are at 7 p.m., March 14th, 22. And we'll kick right in. First, here's a presentation outline of what we'll go over today. A little introduction of LBS Ecological and myself, the DEC program that funded the project, Irvington Woods background and issues. We'll talk a bit about the forest inventory that was conducted in data collection, go over an iTree ecosystem analysis, forestry recommendations, other recommendations, and just a brief conclusion before getting into some question and answers. So here we are, LBS Ecological. My name is Miguel Barrios. LBS Ecological is a firm. We're up in upstate New York, sort of near Ithaca, New York, ecological planning and design, urban forestry. I'm an ecological designer. I've accomplished numerous tree, forest, and ecological surveys, assessments, and management plans. I have a bachelor's degree in natural resources management from Cornell University and a master's degree in landscape architecture from SUNY ESF. I'm also a certified ISA Arborist, and I'm a Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS certified technical service provider for habitat planning. The New York DEC Urban and Community Forestry Program is a partnership between DEC forestry professionals, public and private individuals, and volunteer organizations. It supports communities in comprehensive planning, management, and education to create healthy urban and community forests, which enhance the quality of life for residents. The Irvington Woods Inventory and Community Forest Management Plan, or CFMP for an acronym for short, is grant funded through this program. We've been working closely with Michelle Higgins of the DEC and the local forester, George Profus. They've been working with this from the DEC side of things. So Irvington Woods, as hopefully most everybody knows, is at 251 acres, one of the largest publicly owned contiguous wooded areas in southern Westchester. Irvington Woods draws folks for recreation and nature enjoyment from all over the county, really from all over the country, from New York, as well as from upstate New Jersey, Connecticut. And the woods is home to the Hermit Wetlands. It's also the watershed for Barney Brook, which with other seasonal streams begins in the Hermit Wetlands and flows westward all the way to the Hudson River. There's also probably a bunch of other things worth mentioning about Irvington Woods. Split Rock, which is an amazing rock formation you saw briefly on the intro. There's Sunset Rock, another great place to take advantage over Irvington, see the sunset. There's several little wetlands. There's some ephemeral pools that are critical for wildlife, including salamanders and frogs. And really there's some interesting and cool cultural resources such as the Hermit's Grave and Macy Monument. We're not going to talk a lot about these things, but really we're going to be talking about the woods itself and the health of the woods. I'd mentioned on the last slide that Irvington Woods is one of the largest publicly held forests in southern Westchester. And here's a map of some of the larger forested areas of contiguous forests. And you can see how Irvington Woods is a major component of the larger forest system here, and how it acts as a connective corridor, bringing the forests down from up north and really kind of connecting everything west of the Sawmill River Parkway. So what is going on with the Irvington Woods, and how is its forest health? Well, Irvington Woods is no longer a self-sustaining native forest, and native plant regeneration and recruitment is really a limiting factor to achieving adequate forest health. As such, there's interest in site treatments that promote recruitment of native species and simultaneously suppress invasive and non-native recruitment. And this is really a big common problem in all of the southeastern part of the state. This map shows how forest regeneration is doing as a whole. You can see the red is not good, it's poor condition, and a lot of that is really indicative of the urban land use, sprawling living quarters with folks, people here and there and everywhere, and coming along with that also pressure from deer. So restoration of the Irvington Woods to a healthy ecosystem must begin with a full understanding of its deteriorating condition, which in a large part is triggered by the combination of the overpopulation of deer, competing invasive plants, and light on the forest floor. Even 25 years ago, the woods had dense brambles, shrubs, native shrubs, and vegetation at the ground level. A diversity of species lived in the understory, and the next generation of trees was nurtured there. In the past couple decades, however, the deer have really just decimated everything growing from about 6 feet high down to the ground level. Deer browse is a severe threat to the woods, and the next generation of trees is literally being consumed before they can mature. Therefore, a whole ecology of species that existed in the understory is gone. This lack of understory is allowing invasive vines, shrubs, and trees to proliferate, which is further jeopardizing the health of the ecosystem. Outside of their native habitats, without any pests or control measures these invasive plants have established, they've proliferated rapidly, and they're extirpating the native flora and threatening fauna that relies on these native plants. The large native trees in the forest edges, especially in the southernmost section of Irvington Woods, are also thinning and dying as invasive vines smother, topple them, and as the trees fall, the remaining trees are even more susceptible to being felled by the winds. And increased sunlight reaches the forest floor and exacerbates the invasive plant problem, giving a competitive advantage to the sun-loving deer browse resistant plants, the invasive plants. So now that we kind of understand these issues, what can be done? Well, there's been several studies in the area that suggest that combinations of site interventions, so tree planting, removing the invasives, that type of thing, paired with a full canopy forest are the most effective for promoting regeneration of native species, thus resulting in more self-sustaining urban forests. These studies are showing that improvements in species diversity, structure, and forest complexity can be achieved, and evidence of regeneration and retention of native tree species can be found in restored sites. We can confidently progress forward with the restoration of Irvington Woods through similar site improvements. So mitigating the regeneration issue. As I kind of talked a little bit about earlier, in Irvington Woods, there are 3 defining factors affecting forest regeneration, which we'll address with practices to help grow the forest sustainably. These 3 factors are deer impact, number 1, competing invasive vegetation, number 2, and light on the forest floor, number 3. Deer have reduced tree seedling numbers, seed availability, species composition, and seedling height. They've also affected herbaceous plant composition as the deer browse on some species while ignoring others. These tend to be the invasive plants. In Irvington Woods, overbrowsing has begun to severely affect the habitat, and the deer are creating significant effects. Deer are also having negative impacts outside of the woods. There are more car accidents, incidents of Lyme disease, and deer eat now just about everything from all of everybody's gardens. It's not just your hostas anymore. Here you can see some deer in the woods. It was not very much trouble getting photographs of them at all. They're prevalent, and you can see the understory is really getting affected by these deer. Competing invasive vegetation is next. Consists of plants that interfere with the germination and growth of the desirable seedlings by casting shade across the forest floor and competing in other ways with the native plants. Some of these competing plants also provide cover for small mammals. Some are thorny and close to the ground. They allow these mammals to feed on the native tree seedlings, which are a little bit more palatable. The most prevalent invasive through the woods, from what I've noticed, is barberry. Other invasives are now getting a foothold, though, and in certain areas you can find trees such as Norway Maple, Tree of Heaven, Aurelia, Princess Tree, Black Locust. There's a number of them, and in terms of shrubs, we're seeing burning bush, honeysuckle, privet, seabold, and Japanese viburnum, as well as some other viburnums, multiflora rose, vines like porcelain berry and Asiatic bittersweet. Knotweed is in the forest, garlic mustard, and several other types of invasive herbaceous plants and grasses, such as Japanese stilt grass, Thraxon grasses, and I see some miscanthus grass as well. Really, the whole set of invasives is here, and if it's not here, it's literally knocking on the door. Here's some photos showing some of the competing invasive vegetation, kind of a plethora of all different sorts in the main big photograph, barberry and stilt grass. Light on the forest floor is the third thing we want to talk about. And examining the shade tolerance classes of the majority of desirable trees in Irvington Woods, we find that they fall into a couple different shade tolerance classes. Typically, these are intermediate and tolerant to shade. The undesirable, the invasive trees and shrubs, are typically intolerant of shade. So understanding the shade tolerance characteristics of the desirable and undesirable species forms the basis for developing forestry operation prescriptions. In this instance, we want to not allow enough light into the forest to support the shade intolerant invasive trees and shrubs. We want to have a full canopy. The invasives thrive in sunlight, and we want to have a canopy, full canopy of native trees. So beech forests, for example, are known as one of the darker, more shady forest types. Pretty much, majority of the trees anyway that you're looking at here are beech. It's a great, like I said, shade tolerant native plant, and you can see really there's not much regrowth of invasives where this beech canopy is intact. So we know what to expect, but what exactly is going on in the forest right now? Well, we accomplished an inventory, and that allows us to have some of this information, which is a great snapshot in time. If we do a similar inventory in 10 years, for example, we can directly compare and contrast data. Our team recorded information on trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants. And as part of the inventory, trees were inventoried to species and for their DBH, or diameter at breast height. Shrubs were identified to species and measured in terms of overall plot coverage, and herbaceous plants were identified to genus or species and measured in terms of overall plot coverage as well. When we did the inventory, we also wanted to get information on how the forest is different in certain areas. These different areas are called forest stands. So we looked at the forest not as a whole, but as these forest stands. So a forest stand is a contiguous community of trees sufficiently uniform in composition, structure, age, and size class, spatial arrangement, site quality, condition, a whole number of factors. And it's a collection of these stands, Irvington Woods. For management purposes, Irvington Woods is broken into 7 separate stands, numbered 1 to 7. Each stand is biologically and geographically distinct Some stands are somewhat or very similar, and these stands are grouped into strata for the analysis coming up in iTree. The inventory was accomplished using plot sampling. I had mentioned plots earlier, and basically we look at these plots and extrapolate the data for the entire forest. So for the case of the Irvington Woods here, we did 35 plot locations distributed evenly across the stands. Each plot was 1/10 of an acre, which is about equivalent to a circle with a radius of 37.2 feet. And analysis came next. This is what we do with the data collected in the inventory. Data from the field plots located throughout the woods were analyzed using the iTree eco model. This was developed by the U.S. Forest Service or the research station, and is sort of the flagship main program utilized by the DEC in their program here. Additionally, data from these 35 plots was analyzed using contemporary forest analytics. So when we did that, we included tree species composition, basal area, average diameters, relative density, and regeneration and invasive assessment for the various forest stands. Combined, these analyses aid in making forestry recommendations that will improve both human health and environmental quality for Irvington Woods. So first we'll look at the iTree analysis. This program, like I said, is the DEC's sort of flagship program for these projects. It gives you information such as tree characteristics and urban forest structure. It tells a bit about the pollution removed by the urban forest and its associated percent air quality improvement throughout the year. Total carbon stored and net carbon annually sequestered by the urban forest. Structural value of the forest. So how much these actual trees, if you wanted to try to regrow them, how much are they worth? As well as value for air pollution removal and carbon storage and sequestration. I think I actually just went over that. It also gives information about potential impacts of pests such as Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, gypsy moths, Dutch elm disease, and other types of pests and pathogens that could affect the forest. So the tree characteristics of Irvington Woods is one of the first informations that we're getting out of iTree, and it's telling us that the urban forest of Irvington Woods has an estimated 63,750 trees with a tree cover of basically 100%. The three most common species in the forest are sugar maple, beech, and black birch. And the overall density in Irvington Woods is 280 trees per acre. For this project, the highest densities were found at the reservoir, around the reservoir, followed by the mid-slope stands, and then the highlands after that. These densities aren't indicative of forest health necessarily, they just have more trees per acre, giving you a bit more information about what's growing there. So take note, here are the species composition for the entire forest. Sugar maple, like I said, is the main tree. Beech comes up next, birch, and then lots of oak, red maple, pignut hickory, white oak, tupelo, and then we see finally at 2.4% Norway maple. It's a good one to note because we don't want Norway maple in the forest. It's an exotic tree. It's an invasive tree. The 2.4% isn't too bad. It's a decent number. It means that the tree hasn't really invaded totally, and certainly not into the deeper parts of the forest, but it's not good to see that there because really we're not looking to have that tree in the composition of the forest. We want that number to drop rather than climb and grow, which is probably what it's doing right now. In terms of structural and functional values in the woods, iTree tells us that we have a structural value of $73.3 million of trees growing in the forest, $2.68 million of carbon storage sitting there in the trees, in their wood, etc. We have annual functional values as well, carbon sequestration, so how much carbon they're actually putting on every year at about $60.8 thousand. Avoided runoff is $47.5 thousand. Pollution removal comes in at about $83.7 thousand. So a lot of value in the woods. These ecosystem services have a lot of value. So it's worth improving the woods because, you know, you put in a little bit and you get a lot out basically at the end. Structural value, these are the species with the highest structural value. Red oak, sugar maple are the top. These are largely because maybe they're not as high in numbers, red oak, but huge trees. What it comes down to there. We also see white oak, beech, black oak, tulip tree, black birch, some of these other trees that we see a fair amount of in the woods as well. Now, after the iTree, we ran contemporary forest analyses. We did a program called NED. And these analyses include tree species composition, basal area, average diameters, relative density, and a regeneration and invasive assessment. So we'll start right in with stand 1 and talk about what's going on there. This is a Highland stand. It's an oak dominant stand. It has some northern hardwoods as well. It's located on the western boundary of Irvington Woods near Marshall Pond. If you can see my cursor right over here, it covers the western upland knoll above Barney Brook. The cross-country trail enters this stand. It's an oak dominated forest. Has red oak, black oak, pin oak, and some other types of trees growing as well. That would be, you know, northern hardwood type stuff. So red maple, sassafras and cherry are often abundant in its understory over there. And here, if we look at the composition of what makes up the stand, we can see that black oak, northern red oak, pin oak, red maple, and then Norway maple are some of the bigger constituents here. Norway maple coming in at 8.3. So that's, if you remember, well above the average, which is 2.4. So because this stand is kind of at an edge, it's getting intrusion of these Norway maples, and that's something that we certainly want to have not happening. The regeneration and invasive species analysis revealed that basically there's no regeneration of native species other than white snake root, which is unpalatable to deer. You can kind of find that throughout the forest. Establishment of new tree, shrub, and herbaceous plants is absolutely limited by deer. And the invasive grasses, wineberry, and in this stand, greenbrier, which is a native vine, but can become a bit weedy, were also inventoried. So what are we recommending for stand 1 here? Well, it's going to come down to, well, we want to have all invasive shrubs managed before other forestry operations can take place, such as tree planting and stuff. So we want to look to what's going on with those. The highest pressure from invasives was noted at an opening near the water tower inside the cross-country trail loop and near the intersections to the stand that are kind of northeast of the stand. Species to target are mainly barberry, Japanese viburnum, and wineberry. Like I said, greenbrier also exists in the stand. It's growing quite aggressively and in some cases strangling out native trees and shrubs, but it could be managed to lower numbers rather than being completely eradicated because it is a native vine. You might find grape vines, things like that, poison ivy and Virginia creeper as well. Again, these can be managed to lower numbers. You don't need to eradicate them. But if they're found killing tree canopy, I would certainly recommend taking them out. The woody debris that's generated can be piled together for structures for wildlife, creating wildlife habitat. This stand's also seen the invasion of Norway maple, which I'd mentioned before. That's a non-native species that outcompetes native hardwood species. It's a shade-tolerant species as well, so it can get in even in shady conditions. In this stand, Norway maple trees should be girdled or felled. Wood can actually be left on the forest floor as large woody debris. That's not going to be an issue. It's good to have that in there, actually. This will reduce the abundance of the Norway maple, and it'll slightly open up the canopy, allowing some light in, but not too much. Woody debris, like I said, can be piled together from the trees as well as the shrubs and left where it falls. And you don't need to take it out of the forest and dispose of it. If there are large stems and logs, they can actually probably be used sustainably for building materials at the O'Hara Nature Center in the village and different areas. But large woody debris is actually good. It's good habitat for salamanders and a whole bunch of different other types of wildlife, and it allows the trees to decompose where they normally would and add themselves back into the health of the forest, if you will. The planting of native oaks, hickories, red and sugar maple, and understory trees and shrubs can be accomplished after the brush and the Norway maple has been managed, typically focusing on the areas where the canopy's been opened from the Norway maple removal, and in areas where there's just not as many native species, where they're really being impacted by brush, invasive plants in general. And hopefully their numbers drop off. I'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about a bit of a look into managing the deer. Forest Stand 2 is at the northern part of the woods. It's the second stand in the Highland Strat, and it's located on the northern edge of the woods, like I'd mentioned, really close actually, and incorporates the O'Hara Nature Center. This is an oak maple stand dominated by black oak. There is Norway maple, unfortunately, but a good composition of red oak, red maple, and other native plants. Norway maple is becoming a problem in this stand at 11% of the basal area, which is even more than the previous stand. Also in this stand, we're finding elm, sassafras, white oak, beech, sugar maple, pignut hickory, and black birch. Quite a diverse stand. So here we see what is in the stand. Again, black oak is the biggest player. Northern red oak is next. Again, like I was saying, this is mainly an oak dominated stand, but we do have the Norway maple, which is an issue. An assessment of the understory revealed, again, no regeneration of natives. We had the white snake root, which is unpalatable to deer. But establishment of new tree, shrub, and herbaceous plants in this stand is definitely limited by the deer. Invasive grasses and barberry were inventoried here. So recommendations for this stand. All invasive shrubs should be managed before much else takes place. Areas invasive pressure was noted are basically in the southeastern portion of the stand, and they're lower densities. The guys have been doing an amazing job in this stand, I think particularly because it's close to the nature center. They've been removing the invasives before they really had a good chance to spread. Grape, poison ivy, and Virginia creeper are found in here. Again, we don't need to be overly taking them out unless they're being overly aggressive and killing tree canopy. Removal of the invasive Norway maple in the stand is probably the most important because it exists at high densities, probably the highest density, I believe, of the entire Irvington Woods here. Not at a lost cause type of density, but it is the worst in the woods. Because accomplishing the removal will open the canopy a bit, it'll allow trees that can regenerate at lower light levels, such as that beech that I was mentioning before, and hard maple or sugar maple. The woody debris can be piled to create wildlife habitat, structures for wildlife in this stand as well. It can be left where it falls, if that's easier. Again, it shouldn't be taken from the forest, and it can be used as building materials on site in the forest at the nature center. It can actually be taken out if it's covered in viable seed. So I do want to make that relatively clear. Like if you're pulling barberry, it's covered in seeds, it's fine to get it out of the forest in that condition. But otherwise, I would just leave it in there if it's spring and you're doing invasive removal then. In this stand, the planting of native overstory and understory trees can be accomplished after the brush Norway maple has been managed, again, focusing on areas where the Norway maple was removed. There's already been actually a lot of tree and shrub planting accomplished in this stand because the center, the nature center, has been expanding its plantings from where it's located in the northeast side of the stand. So it's a great place to see what the rest of the woods can be looking like in the future as it's being restored. Stand 3 is the last stand in the Highland stratum. It's another oak dominant stand. Red oak, white oak, black oak are the 3 big ones here. The stand also has sugar maple as a dominant and other species associated with northern hardwood stands such as tulip tree, beech, black birch, and red maple. It's located along the highlands that separate the Barney Brook watershed from the eastern slope that falls down to the Sawmill River. And the highlands here are unique in that they include several little small wetlands, rock outcroppings, and some areas of really nice deep mesic soils. You can see in this stand, that we have a lot of the natives, but we're not seeing many Norway maple trees. This is because this stand is located within the forest and there's really no open edge. So we can see that so far the Norway maple hasn't been able to penetrate into the forest. It's sort of got a grasp on the edge, but it hasn't been able to make too much progress into the forest yet. The understory assessment still reveals that there's little to no regeneration of native species other than, again, white snakeroot. Some Solomon seal was found growing on rock outcroppings. Usually these are eaten by the deer right away, but I think in this case, the deer just haven't been able to get to them. Basically, establishment of new tree, shrub, and herbaceous plants in this stand is absolutely limited by deer. And we're seeing invasive grasses, wineberry, and barberry as well. Recommendations for this stand. Similarly to the others, we want to do all the invasive shrub management before other forestry operations. Highest pressure from invasives here was barberry and wineberry, mainly noted in a drainage that has from a small wetland located centrally in the stand and the drains west to the reservoir. There's also areas south in the stand on hilltops and along some of the trails that were having issues with invasives. There were few invasive trees inventoried for this stand, making it possible to eradicate really these trees when we do find them because their numbers are low. Removal of invasive Norway maple in the stand is probably one of the more important things to do. It'll keep that tree at bay. We don't want it regenerating deeper inside the Irvington Woods. Like the previous stands, we want to have the woody debris managed into either wildlife piles or left as it is on the forest floor. No natural regeneration was noted in this stand, similarly to other areas in the woods. So planting of native overstory and understory trees should be accomplished after the brush and Norway maple has been managed. Again, focusing on areas where the canopy's been opened by Norway maple removal and where there's, other areas that have no mid-story, understory, that type of a thing. Stand 4 is mid-slopes. So we're moving from the highlands into the mid-slopes now. And this is one of the larger stands central to the forest. It's an oak beech forest type, which typically occurs on sites of deep, rich, well-drained soil with minimal disturbance, such as the drainage for Barney Brook. There's stable talus slopes below terrace bluffs and a moist floodplain along the brook. Beech is the distinctive species of this stand, but it is not as abundant as red oak, sweet birch, white oak, and sugar maple. Tulip tree and red maple were also present with more than 5% of the total basal area in the stand. Black oak and chestnut oak are also components of this oak beech forest stand, and young sugar maple usually dominates the understory, along with sassafras, hornbeam, hop hornbeam. Shrubs are infrequent, but woody vines such as grape, Virginia creeper, and poison ivy are often abundant. This is another stand that has less Norway maple because it has less edge, and the Norway maple hasn't invaded deeply yet. So we can see mainly we're looking at, as we go around the circle, all native trees. That's a good sign. An assessment of the understory still reveals that there's little to no regeneration of native species other than the snake root, and a Solomon seal again here was found. Spice bush was also inventoried. This is a native shrub that is not very palatable to deer. Spice bush is its name because it's actually quite spicy. It was actually browsed by the deer, the spice bush, but it was still able to live. Which was nice to see. Establishment of new tree, shrub, and herbaceous plants in the stand is absolutely limited by deer, and invasive grasses, still grass primarily, garlic mustard, wineberry, and barberry were inventoried in the plots. Recommendations for this stand. Well, we honestly have pretty similar recommendations as to previous, but another worry for this stand is beech bark disease and beech leaf disease. Beech bark isn't really taking too bad of a toll, but unfortunately, beech leaf disease was noticed in the stand last year. So in 2021, beech leaf disease is a disease that affects and kills both native and ornamental beech tree species. It's associated with a nematode, and it was only recently discovered, and there's not actually much known about it. We're still trying to figure out the full cause of how it spreads. And really, it's unfortunate because what we do know about it is that it can kill mature beech trees in 6 to 10 years. It can sometimes kill younger trees even more quickly. And, small saplings that, or maybe in the understory, they're not getting a lot of light. Some of them are being killed as little as 1 year. Symptoms of this disease can be seen in the leaves. We see striping, curling, and these leaves kind of looking almost like they're turning into leather and drying out. You can see it from May until leaf off. And if you look up into the canopy, you just end up basically seeing a lot more light penetrating. As the leaves wither and die and they yellow, it really opens up more light. Unfortunately, not a lot is known, like I said, about this disease. So managing it is going to be something that we want to look into. And certainly if there's options, we want to take those options. In the stand, invasive shrubs are also a threat to native trees. These should all be managed before other forestry operations. Highest pressure from invasives were for barberry, wineberry, Japanese viburnum. These were noted typically down in the lower Barney Brook drainage area and in the western portion of the stand on hillsides and in smaller drainages that feed Barney Brook, including the drainage from Ice Pond. There's an area adjacent to the municipal compost area that has an open canopy and therefore an increased pressure and a kind of a diversity of invasives. Phragmites, for example, is found in this wet opening. Basically, there's more in terms of invasives going on around that opening because of the edge effect. There are a few invasive trees inventoried in the stand, making it possible to keep them at bay and possibly eradicate them while their numbers are low. Removal of invasive Norway maple and Aurelia in this stand is most important. It'll keep these trees from regenerating deeper inside the Irvington Woods. Really, there was not much in terms of natural regeneration in this stand. So planting native overstory and understory trees and shrubs can be accomplished after the brush and trees, invasive brush and trees have been managed, focusing again on areas with open canopy, where there are areas with no mid-story or understory. We want to be planting in those spots. Forestry operations in this stand should not negatively affect the riparian and wetland areas to the maximum extent possible as well. Stay out of the brook really, and keep clear of the wetlands. Stand 5 is the second stand in the mid-slope stratum. It's an oak dominant stand with northern red oak and black oak accounting for almost 70% of the basal area. Stands at the stand is the most southern portion of Irvington Woods on land that's moderately steep, but has a south east facing aspect. Along with the oaks, there's sweet birch, red maple, sugar maple, Norway maple, which is the invasive we want to keep out, pignut hickory, there's beech trees. This stand has a high invasive tree and shrub level. Stand down here, 5. Has a lot of edge on Cyrus Field Road and down along the Sawmill River Parkway. So unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of invasive plants there, and some that aren't existing in other parts of the woods, such as burning bush and Siebel viburnum. So a lot of oak in this stand. And Norway maple isn't that high yet here, but it very well may explode in numbers because this stand is kind of on a trajectory, downhill trajectory. And it didn't show up on the chart here either, but this stand has princess tree growing in it. It has Aurelia growing in it, has tree of heaven. All of these can grow into forest trees and become quite large problems. None of the other stands had the problems that this one does. Again, there's little to no regeneration of native species, and everything is being limited by the deer. Invasive grasses and other invasives in this stand are pretty bad as well. Wineberry, barberry, burning bush, Siebel viburnum, like I mentioned before, and a lot of invasive vines. So we're seeing a lot in this stand, vines climbing up, toppling trees. And they might not have killed a lot of them yet, but there's a lot of potential to kill them. So we're looking at this stand as sort of, being attacked harder than a lot of the other stands, and one that we certainly want to have more input to. Like I mentioned before, because this stand is in the southern part of the woods, it has a greater edge effect. So these trees, invasive trees and shrubs are proliferating, they're invading. As I mentioned before, barberry, the viburnums, wineberry, burning bush, princess tree, Asiatic bittersweet vine. These all need to get managed before we can do much in terms of planting. There's also many invasive trees, like I mentioned before, the Norway maple, the princess tree, the Aurelia, all that stuff needs to be managed. There hasn't been natural regeneration really noted in this stand. So planting native overstory and understory trees should be accomplished after the invasive brush and trees have been managed. And also in this stand, we're recommending a deer exclusion fence. So a temporary poly deer mesh fence. So because the canopy's deteriorated to a large degree in stand 5, we're recommending to install a 15-acre deer exclusion fence to reduce the proliferation of invasive plants and to promote natural regeneration largely too. Natural regeneration can be successful and the fence can be removed after approximately 10 years or so. That's long enough time to have regeneration and have the plants grow above deer browse height. Especially if the deer are managed adequately in the future, this should really jumpstart this stand. Stand 6, the stand on the eastern slope, is a northern hardwood stand that's found along the Sawmill River Parkway largely, and the river itself. It's dominated by sugar maple, along with tulip tree, has several species of oak. It also has black gum, beech, hickory, red maple, and elm. It has some invasive tree and shrub pressure, mostly along the southern part of the stand and along the Sawmill River Parkway. And some trees we're seeing which were killed by invasive vines. So we want to take care of those problems. Garlic mustard is also common in this stand. So you can see that there isn't a large population of invasive trees again in this stand, even though it's seen, it has a large edge along the parkway, maybe somewhat because the steepness of the terrain with the seed from these invasive plants not able to disperse uphill. Also, there's just a really excellent canopy of native trees. Some of the bigger, most majestic trees are found in this stand. And as long as they stay relatively intact, the edge can take a bit of a beating, but as long as we can beat those plants back, they shouldn't be able to get into the forest itself. Again, we're looking at little to no regeneration of native species other than, again, snake root, establishment of new tree, shrub, and herbaceous plants in the stands, absolutely limited by deer. Invasive grasses, preliminarily stilt grass, wineberry, barberry, garlic mustard, Seabold viburnum were inventoried. So management here, invasive brush is found throughout the stand with higher density, like I had mentioned, on the eastern boundary of the stand toward the Sawmill River Parkway and toward the southern part of the stand. Another area that's got high invasive pressure is the drainage. There's a drainage central in the stand where the Hermit's Grave Trail is located and where there's an old driveway or roadway up the hill. We want to target the species such as barberry, wineberry, and burning bush, Seabold viburnum, Japanese viburnum. Again, we'll probably find grape, poison ivy, and Virginia creeper in here. We can, if they're toppling and taking trees over, cut those vines as well, but those are native, so we don't have to be over the top with those. We don't want to eradicate, but we do want to manage. Woody debris, similarly to previous stands, can be piled together for structures for wildlife. We want to take out the invasive trees, mainly Norway maple here again, which are found typically on the eastern boundary. Focusing on this area and other areas that I just noted previously. We can take the trees out, the shrubs out, and then plant native overstory and understory trees and shrubs after the invasive brush and Norway maple has been managed. I didn't think I'd mentioned it before, but all this tree and shrub establishment is going to be trees and shrubs that will be protected by tree tubes so that the deer can't actually eat them. They grow up through the tube above deer browse height and then keep growing. Stand 7, I call the Reservoir Novel stand. It's sort of an early successional native and exotic mix around the reservoir. It consists of plantation conifers, spruce and pine, Norway spruce and white pine, and early successional natives and exotic invasive plants. There's an oak dominant canopy. Usually it's a black and red oaks, with sugar maple and sweet birch saplings and pole trees. That's black birch. However, there's a large population of invasive and exotic trees, including, again, Norway maple, black locust, which is a native but invasive plant, and princess tree. Several areas of emergent wetland and wet meadow associated with a reservoir abut stand. And these edges are also include wetland invasive plants such as reed canary grass, Phragmites, and Japanese knotweed, which is a plant that grows in wet but also can establish in dry areas. It's difficult to get rid of. So you can see this young stand that was once cleared and replanted into some plantation conifers has many more invasive and many more types of trees and plants in it. Norway maple at 7.9%. We want to take care of that. Black locust and princess tree were all abundant enough to make it onto this chart. So, we want to target all those invasive species. An assessment of the understory reveals that there's little to no regeneration of native species, again, other than the white snake root. And we're not really seeing establishment of any new regeneration. So that's all limited by the deer, by the invasive brush. And we see a lot of invasive grasses, wineberry, barberry, Seabold viburnum, Phragmites I'd mentioned. Lots of problems in this stand. So recommendations. There's some forest openings and areas of thinner canopy, several areas of plantation evergreens. We want to work through and take the invasives out of that, but certainly we don't want to try to be taking down any of the Norway spruce. Largely, we're trying to manage the invasive shrubs. We're trying to fell or girdle Norway maple and other invasive trees and shrubs to keep a situation where the forest will grow. And we'll need to keep managing it because of the more sunlight, basically, that the stand is going to be getting. We want to target Norway maple, black locust, Aurelia. I think I've mentioned this before. Invasive Japanese knotweed and Phragmites, canary grass, miscanthus grass were also found in this stand. These are very destructive to wet habitats and are found in several wetland areas currently, but Japanese knotweed was the only really found here in the forest. So I'd recommend eradicating it so it can't spread to other areas in the forest, wet areas. And like I said, it can grow even in some drier areas as well. There was some miscanthus grass too growing in, there's a little opening to the northern part of the reservoir, and that should be eradicated so it doesn't spread as well. In this stand, similar to other stands, the planting of native overstory and understory trees and shrubs should be accomplished after the invasive trees and brush have been managed and turned into structures for wildlife. And really no regeneration was noted. So we want to have some plantings here, and hopefully we'll have regeneration if the deer can be successfully managed adequately through a deer management type of program in the future. This is the schedule of operations for the project. So in 2023, basically, we're going to have a bunch of invasive brush management going on, some targeted openings and more high intensity brush management going on as well in stand 1, 4, 5, and 7. In all these stands, we can build structures for wildlife, aka brush piles with some of the debris. We want to do timber stand improvement, which is more or less a Norway Maple cull, culling the Aralias, princess trees, and other invasives. And then after that, you know, a couple of years after, that was 2025, we want to start planting back into the forest. In the same year, put in the deer exclusion fence, which will allow actually for regeneration within that fence as well. So it should have a lot of potential to come back. All right, so now other than the forestry recommendations for each stand in the woods, there's some other administrative type recommendations that I'd like to mention, starting right off with a community deer management program. A community-based deer management program is a guided process for addressing deer-related problems, focuses on careful planning, targeted actions, and measuring progress. The process is flexible, helping communities adapt their deer management program as needs change over time. More information can be found, as well as a starter kit, at deeradvisor.dnr.cornell.edu. This is a Cornell program, which has been adopted by a bunch of municipalities throughout the state. It includes 4 different phases. The CBDM process starts with phase 1, a problem definition. So deer-related concerns become so prominent, basically, that community leaders charge a person or a committee to gather information, assess the situation, define the scope of the problem. As a community learns by doing, can revise it, the problem definition, and subsequent management cycles. Phase 2, we have decision-making. Stakeholders and citizens consider management alternatives and recommend actions. Community officials use this information from the group to establish desired outcomes for a deer management program and set a course of action. Phase 3, implementation. We develop the management plan and carry it out. And then finally, phase 4, evaluation, adaptation. Evaluation is a pre-planned vital component for any community's deer management program by tracking a set of indicators over time. Communities can assess progress toward established management goals, learn by doing, adjust management objectives and the overall approach or specific actions depending on what works and what's not working. So deer management. The next recommendation is to train up someone with arborist credentials, ISA, or International Society of Arboriculture. Successful stewardship of a thriving urban forest requires the in-house expertise of a certified arborist who's got a clearly defined responsibility. I thought either at the O'Hara Nature Center or at the Department of Rec and Parks for overseeing the urban forest. So planning, training, supervision, scheduling, developing further Department of Recreation and Parks protocols, etc. The arborist can lead a crew specifically trained to provide the necessary workforce to improve the trees of the Irvington Woods. They can provide well, they should be provided training opportunities to ensure that current BMPs are being applied and that the urban forest and other green infrastructure are being done correctly, and coordinate tree planting and tree care performed by the staff of the Nature Center, consultants really, or also the Department of Recreation and Parks. Next, the village should update the inventory and take new data in the future. This will allow for a clear understanding of the forest's health over time and can help to show what's been working, what can change, and reveal other issues or even opportunities for managing the woods. So I'm recommending develop a process for regularly sharing information between the Nature Center, Department of Recreation and Parks, the Woods Committee, and other groups regarding plantings, removals, and trends in tree conditions. So noting everything that's happening in the woods. We should also charge the Irvington Woods Committee with developing a process that will use the public or coordinated citizen volunteers to help gather information on tree status. So just adding a little bit of capacity by having folks go to take data. So we know folks can go out and pull up invasive shrubs, but also folks can go out and take information as well. And I recommend undertaking a periodic sample inventory, similarly to what was done here, beginning no later than 5 years from the adoption of the plan. Focus on a particular planning issue or concern, or really doing a similar, just so we have another snapshot of what the woods is looking like in the future after restoration has been occurring. And set additional planting targets for progress in the urban forest. The O'Hara Nature Center and Department of Recreation and Parks can work with the Irvington Woods Committee to set additional future planting targets as well, and priority planting and maintenance areas for all forest areas within the woods. Determine metrics that will be used to measure progress towards goals of an improved urban forest. So are we having, for example, more canopy closure? What does our number of trees look like in the future? What do we have for native species versus invasive species in the future? And we can look again at iTree for environmental, social, and economic benefits and adopt targets for those. This is going to be extra important if the CBDM program isn't fully fleshed out too, or up to speed. If we still do have deer, for example, we might have to take a different approach, maybe. Some of the plants also, the deer have already really decimated, so there's no seed bank to get them going again. So plantings to add diversity and that sort of thing are also going to be important in the future. And we need to revisit that. We can find and leverage resources and funds for urban forest improvement. Apply for the next round of DEC funding, for example, for a grant for a tree planting. We also, because we know about all the benefits that we found out from iTree, we can mobilize financial and human resources, both public and private, to preserve and expand the forest. You should also leverage village funds whenever possible by applying for matching grants. The DEC and Arbor Day Foundation are two likely possibilities for matching grant opportunities. I can look at their websites to see what is going on there. And then, of course, research and apply for other federal, state, foundational, private environmental stewardship grants as well. And lastly, promote community and grassroots efforts. Engaging the public in care and stewardship of the urban forest is critical. Building public-private partnerships to achieve the goals from the plan here can raise awareness about what's actually going on. So through education, collaboration, and exchange of information and among stakeholders about the value and needs of the urban forest, so some of the information that we've discovered. Engaging with the village's property owners and local businesses, developers, design community to promote the goals of the urban forest, outreach like that. Educate the public about the rationale behind the project goals and objectives. Some of the BMPs, which I'm talking about, the best management practices for the forest, and tree planting lists. And also bring focus to village tree plantings by bundling them into campaigns that will attract public interest. We can generate more energy, interest by announcing plantings, greening campaigns, inviting public participation, really just adding capacity any way possible. This grassroots effort's been one which has been strong in Irvington, and one that we definitely want to keep bolstering. It's one of the main reasons I'm giving this presentation now, to get folks like you all to come up and help in the woods. Much of what you can do for the Irvington Woods will begin at the O'Hara Nature Center. He was introduced earlier, but CJ O'Reilly, some of the other folks at the Nature Center have a ton of opportunities to explore and learn about the woods, interact with it, help restore it. Groups such as the Vine Squad, Girl Scouts, school groups are steadily helping out and are always looking for more interest. So please reach out if you can. Now, in conclusion, there's great need and good timing for restoration in Irvington Woods. There's been many studies proving restoration potential and value improvement. Largely what we're looking at is invasive removal, native species plantings. In Stand 5, we're looking at a deer exclusion fence and trying to see natural regeneration within that fence. We talked a bit about other urban forestry recommendations, including the community-based deer management and, galvanizing community support. Those are the big topics. And now I'll open it up for some questions and answers.
So let's see here. I have a few questions that have been submitted already. So if you want, I'll pass those along, and then we'll also invite attendees if they want to speak up and ask their question live. But I'll start with them. You have them in your chat, but I'll read them out to you. So, are the challenges presented by the deer unique to the woods, or are they simply reflective of pressures on the surrounding community as well? If the deer do impact the broader community, what are the pros and cons of trying to address these issues in the woods alone?
There was a slide earlier on that actually kind of showed a map, but it's a common problem. It's happening, in the villages south, villages north. So it's something that we want to approach in the woods and do what we can for the woods, because if we don't, they're gonna sort of take a turn for the worse. So we want to manage to make sure that we're not losing canopy, that we're not losing species diversity and that sort of thing. I think that the community-based deer management is going to be a really important topic that happens into the future, because really, if the deer population can be managed adequately, we don't have to do nearly the amount of plantings in the woods, for example. We can count on natural regeneration to be there for bringing the next recruits of forest trees in for the next canopy as other trees die, because every tree grows and dies, and they need to have the next cohort, I guess, growing up behind it. So it is a bigger picture issue that we are even currently looking into, but there are management practices that we can do in the woods now, even with the deer pressure being high.
So sticking on the deer theme, there's a question, what are the options for deer management?
There's a bunch of options for deer management, everything from culling deer, immunocontraception, fencing, and from what I understand, a lot of communities end up more or less limiting deer by culling them ultimately. I think that there's going to be some other opportunities, but that needs to really get clarified in the community-based deer management process, because it takes more than just my input to bring clarity to that.
The Irvington Woods Committee has already taken a start on the deer issue through some of our membership. We've done a community survey. It's something we're on top of, and we know it's going to require a lot of work, but it is definitely something that is a focus for our committee.
Certainly.
So another question, as you know, there's been a fenced deer exclusion area in in place just south of the nature center? Has it been successful? That's the first question. Has it allowed for regeneration of the understory within the fenced area? And if not, how could you do it differently?
Well, the area that was built, I'll take it, Miguel, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
The area that was originally built as the exclosure actually was, it fell apart and it had to be rebuilt about a year and a half ago. So I don't think we've been able to see real benefits at this point. I think CJ and Peter might be able to be more accurate with the way it looks right now. CJ?
Sure, Joe. So I'd say for the last year and a half plus, the fence has been secure. And Miguel can also talk to this too about kind of there's a large American beech in there that puts out a lot of shade, and with the lack of seed index in that area, we're not seeing that much regeneration. Miguel, do you want to? You were in that area. Do you want to build off any of that? There's a few that are coming up, but outside of that,
Yep. It is in a shadier spot, and part of the issue is that you can fence the deer out, but if they've been eating the forest floor for 20 years straight, they're really not leaving much in terms of a seed bank there, because anything that was a seed, it's germinated and it's been eaten. So you almost have to wait for the seed that's falling into that exclosure to start germinating to see much of a difference. It is good to see sassafras starting to grow there and other seedlings coming up. I think that's a good sign, but it's a very small exclosure, and I think a little bit larger of an exclosure will show us that there's a lot more potential to it.
Those are the written questions I've seen. Anyone that would like to ask a question live, feel free to put up your hand, raise your hand, and I'll give you a chance to ask your question. In the meantime, we do have a written question that was submitted, Miguel. So it's why are non-native species considered bad?
The non-native species, well, not all of them are considered bad. It largely comes down to whether they're considered an invasive species or not. A lot of different species that are exotic will not really start taking over and outcompeting the other plants. But when they become, in that they displace the native plants, they become an issue in that respect. And there's a number of different ways to view that, but largely I like to think that they're certainly causing an issue for the native forests.
Also on the question of invasives, other than Norway maple, are there any other types of invasive trees that should be focused on for removal?
Yep. So Norway maple is the big one, not larger, but it's the bigger threat, largely because it can regenerate and it creates a large amount of shade and it becomes a dominant forest canopy tree. But there's a few other trees that we want to look out for as well. Aurelia is a smaller tree, but it's still a tree. Tree of Heaven is another one, or Ailanthus. And I've seen some of those in the forest that are getting bigger and bigger as well. We see Princess Tree as well. It's got beautiful flowers, but it'll take over and outcompete the native plants as well. When combined with deer especially. And there might be a few others in there, but those are sort of the main culprits.
Another question, how much do you think the Asian jumping worm is causing damage like erosion?
Earthworms are definitely causing some damage as well. And these worms, typically you can kind of see they eat right through the duff on the forest floor and leave kind of worm casings behind. So it is much easier to see erosion. Believe it or not, a lot of the a lot of the earthworms, even before the Asian jumping worms, are exotic, more native to Europe or Eurasia. And I like to call it global warming. It's kind of a big issue, probably not as bad as the global warming issue, but it's a difficult sort of issue to tackle because there's not really much you can do to eradicate these worms. You know, folks have tried different techniques to, spray for them and things like that, but really it ends up doing more damage, I like to think, than it actually causes it to improve. You end up killing a lot of small animals and vertebrates and things like that in the meantime, and you don't really get a lot of good results from it. So I think that the worms are going to be one that we have to sort of live with. They do cause some erosion. I think that might be some of the cause of some of the like garlic mustard proliferating and things like that. But starting with, the larger canopy trees, getting some shrubs and things like that, mid-story trees in place is going to be more important than trying to deal with the earthworms right off the bat.
So another question, how did you determine the timeline on planting natives after the non-native invasives removal?
Yep, those come in typically a year or two after we've started in with the invasives removal. There's certainly going to be impetus to have a bit of monitoring going on. So if we're seeing an incredible regrowth or something like that, we're going to want to set that back. But typically after most all of the invasives have been removed, we might see some regrowth, but you can kind of manage that even around planted trees and shrubs. So it's better to have something that you want growing in there ultimately, as long as it doesn't get in the way of dealing with the other plants, the invasive plants.
Sticking with the invasives, should the village take a more aggressive approach to remove Norway maples outside the woods?
Absolutely. Stopping using invasive plants in general should be occurring throughout. I know that there have been some recommended trees and shrubs to be planting instead of these invasives. These are all little sort of documents you can find on the village website, recommendations for plants that would, for example, be a better fit for planting than the invasive plants. So you could definitely check all that out. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of folks aren't willing to take out a Norway maple growing in their front yard because it's 2 foot in diameter, and they're a pretty tree. They were planted because they're ornamental. But we do want to not plant any more to whatever capacity we have. These invasive plant lists are, like I said, on the village website, and the DEC certainly has a list as well that you can pull off of their website. So if you have any questions as to whether you're planting something invasive or not, you can certainly figure that out.
This may be more for the rest of the panel. Do you think our community would get behind culling of deer? And the observation is that it seems like it might be the only solution. If people understand the problem of nature being out of balance, can that education make a difference?
I think that, educating is the most important thing. That's kind of why we're here, to figure it out. I don't know if the village can get behind it or not. I think that we're still too early to actually have an answer to that, but we can certainly figure out if that is going to be a solution by working through the community-based deer management program.
Yeah, and the Woods Committee, as Joe said, is looking to address that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a complicated issue and sensitive issue. We're trying to make sure we take small steps, learn as we go, and we'll use the word Miguel's used and try to educate not only the public but ourselves as to what our options may be. I don't think we're in any position to take a position on it right now. But I saw another question. I don't know if you did. If you don't mind, I'll read it. Would a deer fence also mean that people would not have access to those stands while regeneration is underway. 15 acres is quite a large area. Also, does a larger enclosure mean that the pressure, I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble reading the rest of the question. Okay,
Yeah.
I got you.
You want to get that? So does a
Yes.
larger enclosure mean that the pressure caused by the deer will direct pressure to other parts of the area and further afield?
I got you. So a deer fence certainly has potential to keep people out of that area of the stand. Deer fences can easily have doors built into them as well. So I would think it'd be a really good idea to at least build an in and out door, if for nothing else, for folks who are going to monitor the stand to get in and out of the fence. That stand actually does not have any trails through it. I didn't put an overlay of the trail system map with that stand in particular into the presentation today, but there's no conflict of trails there. There might be a herd trail that runs sort of down toward the parkway. And that could certainly be something that people use that should still have, a door in and out. But, signage is going to be important. Setbacks are going to be important. So we're not looking at it right off the road or having an issue with a fence like right along the roadway. A lot of these sort of specifications have been written into the plan, but I just didn't have the time really to talk about them tonight. And the pressure caused by the deer, I didn't hit on that note yet. With the 15 acres, you're going to be displacing deer to a small extent, but I don't foresee that they're going to, typically they're going to drop out and drop their numbers lower as they run out of actual habitat. But I don't think 15 acres is going to, make the deer have higher pressure on any of these other areas.
So another question, how much are dogs a problem or a help?
Well, dogs off leash are probably a problem in other ways. They probably would scare the deer, but they're certainly not like a wolf or a coyote going to be taking down deer and reducing their numbers in a sort of natural way that is just not going to happen. So I don't think that they're going to be a help or a hindrance, really. I think that they're just going to be similar to people hiking through the forest too, who will spook a deer, but certainly not keep them away from their forage grounds there.
Miguel, has there been any successful steps taken in Hastings where they did a similar study? Do you know of any steps that they've taken that have started to show results for them?
Yep, they've been actually doing a fair amount of invasive species remediation, so they've been doing a lot of work there. The forest there is actually probably deteriorated, several years beyond what's been happening in Irvington for sure. And it's almost like their entire forest was looking like Stand 5. They're still looking very promisingly at having a large exclosure fence, a permanent fence put in place. So that should be interesting to see how that all comes together here coming up too, because that'll certainly keep the deer out adequately. And hopefully they would be into working together as, villages in Southern Westchester here at coming together with a deer management program, because even with that fence intact, it's still, I think there'd be impetus to have a lower amount of deer, just so that other areas in the forest there that aren't fenced, as well as just general areas throughout the different villages and things like that. Again, it's a problem for the woods, but the deer also, people are hitting them with cars. There's Lyme disease. There's a bunch of other factors with deer overpopulation that should be considered as well. But they've been making steps for sure. And I'm looking forward to hearing from them to see how their fence installation goes coming up.
So an important question, is there any grant money available to jumpstart a program like this?
There is, like I had mentioned before, even with the DEC, there's some tree planting potential. Arbor Day was another one that I'd mentioned, I believe, too, and there's some other grants as well. These are all kind of rotating, rolling, and they're kind of ongoing. So there might be some new grants coming up as well. I don't have a really close touch on the pulse of what these grants are doing right now, but there's certainly opportunities. Yep, at least a few that I'd mentioned there, and then probably I'm expecting there to be a lot more as well. I know the DEC has got a Regenerate New York program going on right now. I think it's a little bit more based on working woodlands. So I don't know if that would be applicable. I don't think there's a round open for it now, but there's a lot of looking into regeneration, basically, because we're having failing regeneration in forests, like I'd mentioned before, not just in Irvington, but it's all throughout the state, and certainly throughout the southeast of the state.
A couple
Good
more
question.
here.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
Okay, is chronic wasting disease likely to impact the deer population like it has upstate?
I don't know if I want to say I hope so, but I think the deer population is out of its homeostasis, and when populations are not, where they should be in the environment, there's typically something that ultimately, manages to bring them back into a more reasonable number, I guess. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. I certainly saw that it had a lot of effect on deer up the river. And I think that we'll probably hear a bit more about that as the year progresses.
A couple of questions related to invasive removal. So the quantity of invasive shrubs like barberry seems enormous. How much work is potentially involved in removing a significant amount? What progress have other communities made in terms of percentage removal?
I've seen forests basically cleaned of it. What you can actually do in Irvington Woods is go and look up near the nature center, where sort of it's easiest to get rid of invasives. And the forest is looking quite good over there. There's even plantings that you can look at. So I like to think that if the rest of the forest could look like that and have the input that's been seen there, we'll have a lot of success. But it's a lot of work, but there's professionals that basically do it. And you couple that with having a bunch of volunteers doing things as well, and I think that you can really see a lot of progress quick.
I will ask CJ to talk about the invasive program we have going. In fact, we have another opportunity for anyone who wants to help coming up this Saturday, I believe, right, CJ?
Yeah.
And we've been removing vines for over a year now, with the help of many members of the Woods Committee, in particular, Zoe Hamilton and Nikki Coddington, who then worked with CJ and Peter. I don't even want to begin to, we've removed so many. And as Miguel said, if you go close to the nature center and you look in the areas around that, you'll see what a difference the removal has made. So CJ, can you elaborate on this a little more, please?
Sure. So typically twice a month, we run our Japanese barberry removal program, starting in kind of the end of October through the end of April. When the weather gets cooler, ticks are cold-blooded, so we want to kind of work when they're least active. And we can post that information after the video today. It's always on the Community Pass, which is the registration program we use for the Recreation and Parks Department. It's a free-based volunteer program. So if you want to learn more, learn about the education materials and the stewardship that you can be a part of, that's a great way to start. Because we have got Miguel, I think it's best to maybe keep the questions going towards Miguel, and then Japanese barberry or other invasive cleanup work, maybe we can post through the village or the Rec and Parks or the nature or the Irvington Woods website. Does that sound good?
So circling back to one other question to hit on, just a general question about dogs. Do they impact the ecosystem in any other ways?
Sure. I think that, an urban park, we sort of expect there to be humans and dogs and all sorts of other things, but they certainly chase wildlife. They leave footsteps, they leave dog poop behind, which can have bacteria and things like that. So it adds a little bit of sort of unsavory elements, but overall, I wouldn't think that a dog on leash is really, harming the environment much more than having a hike with an extra person or something through the woods.
How about bikes, Miguel?
Bikes as well. I think that usually, they might tear up the trail to an extent, but most bikes and most people honestly kind of stay on the trail at least. So you're seeing probably trail erosion at worst from bikers. I don't think that they're going to be harming the environment, unless they're bringing a bunch of invasive seeds in on their tires or something like that, which I really don't think is the case.
How much are deer the cause of tick movement, maybe as compared to other animals?
It's another good question. They certainly harbor ticks, the deer do, but a number of small animals do as well. I've heard folks say that even, mice and things are more likely to carry, a large amount of ticks compared to deer, even though it's called a deer tick. It's certainly not exclusive to deer, but a high number of deer or high number of whatever the ticks are on. I think we're not going to, see the elimination of ticks in the near future. So I think we just need to end up kind of learning to work with them and hoping that their numbers will drop out as the deer numbers drop down as well.
Miguel, can you talk a little bit about the number of hazardous trees that you identified?
Sure. Yeah. So I didn't really mention it in the presentation here, but we also did along the trail system. So we went through, and just for the general health and well-being of people hiking in the woods, we wanted to mark trees that would be, a high-risk tree that should get removed, as well as note the locations of trees that, are dangerous to people. So if there's a large hanging limb, widowmaker, if you want to call it that, something like that, we made notes on that, located those trees, and then let the village know where they are. So beyond the plan for sort of a forest health for the woods, we also have in the plan, again, like I didn't put it into the presentation much today because it's a little bit more internal for the village, I believe, but people aren't going to go out as a volunteer and probably cut down a hazardous tree or anything like that, or prune a hazard tree, but you should be safer walking down the trails in the future because a lot of the hazardous trees have been either removed already or have been slated for a type of removal or a pruning to make them safe again.
If there's any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. Raise your hand if you want to be heard. But I think we're caught up on our questions as of now. All right.
Yeah, I one thing on the trails, is there any recommendation? The compaction on a lot of our trails is pretty severe. Is there any suggestion if there are heavily used areas, if we wanted to try to make the trails a little bit more attractive or take away some of that erosion or some of that compaction, that you would recommend we use?
I guess if they're a really highly used trail, they could be improved in some sorts of ways, especially I would imagine around the nature center, to allow access, or for folks that might be limited in terms of their ability to access the woods. in the woods themselves, you know, we're more looking at kind of single track hiking paths. There is some erosion going on, some hard packed areas. Typically, I more worry about trails washing out through erosion and from stormwater issues, basically. So water bars, step stones, things like that are great to keep people in the trail so they're not wandering around, widening trails out and impacting the vegetation alongside the trail. But I like the idea of having improved trails to get folks through, especially if they're in an area where there might be interpretive signage and people might not get in so far if they're the type of folks who don't want to get their, you know, they didn't have their boots and want to get their feet all dirty. So trail improvement can certainly happen, but overall I thought the trails were in decent shape. Some tree falls have happened and those need to get cut out so people can get past those. Some of them have already happened because I've been there several times throughout the past year or so. But, you know, trail work probably should mainly consist of water bars, step stones, and anywhere you see kind of the trails eroding down. The key really is to get that water off the trail before it has a chance to do any erosion or pick up any velocity heading down a hill or something like that. And that can certainly be done, but it didn't jump out to me as an incredible issue. And it doesn't really affect forest health so drastically, but park planning, those sorts of things should be considered for sure. And getting people through the woods is important. So having good trail systems is good. I know that folks have been talking about updating the trail maps and eliminating possibly some herd trails and getting the trails so people are staying in the same trail. They know where they are and they're not kind of just wandering aimlessly through the forest on trails that might or might not be a trail. Yeah, erosion is an issue, but not a huge one.
Question about deer scat. Is it a health hazard on people's lawns?
I wouldn't eat a picnic right there if I were you. I don't know if I would say that it's too hazardous, but I think any scat from any animal you don't really want to get too up and close and personal with.
So in the chat, I posted that if there's questions after this session, feel free. CJ, I sacrificed you on this one, so you can send your question to CJ. He'll get you an answer. I put his email address in there. And I believe CJ also posted the information about the invasives removal for this coming weekend.
And what we can do too, just because we've got Miguel here tonight, I'll work with Joe Archino and Mr. Schaffer tomorrow to get any additional information that came up in today's chat on our website. So.
We have here.
Miguel, so can you just tell us what the next steps will be for you as far as finalizing your report?
Sure, yeah. We're just putting the final details together, going through for any last edits and things on the report. If anybody that's listening tonight has any comments or information that they'd like to see in there that might not be in there, or questions about anything, they can certainly reach out to me. I think I had put my email earlier on into the presentation, but it's miguel@landbeyondthesea.com. I foresee our next steps as kind of finalizing everything with the plan, and then mainly getting into completing some of the work. So we have a schedule of operations, and we basically have a year to prep up to that. I know some work's ongoing already as we speak, so we don't need to wait until 2023 to do anything, but at the same rate, it gives us plenty of time to get started up in earnest. We can have a meeting, kick off whatever it needs for implementation, and start up on that.
Good. Well, I want to I want to thank you, Miguel, obviously very thoughtful, well-prepared, informative session. And thank you, the rest of the panel, for coming out tonight. And thank you to the public for attending. This will be, it was actually live streamed and will be archived and available for viewing later. So if there's something you wanted to review again, it'll be there.
One thing, Larry, I just want to make sure the public knows too, because Miguel just hit on it, is I think it's important for the community to know we're not waiting. In addition to all of the invasive vine work that's been going on, Peter Strom and CJ, I think, have taken down close to 40 of the trees that were identified by Miguel that should come down and that they had the capability of doing, and they've done it themselves. So we're very grateful to have both of them, and they're out there, you know, at least once a week, they'll be out doing some tree work. So the community should know we are moving forward. We're in touch with Miguel pretty regularly. We listen to what he has to say. CJ and Peter are both very skilled individuals, and we're trying to get a jump on everything. And there'll be a lot more coming, invasive vine work and things like that. We'd love to get more of the community involved. We'd love you to come out and be part of it. And there's lots of ways you can do that. So I appreciate everyone who took the time to be part of this tonight. And Miguel, again, on behalf of CJ and Peter and I, have had the chance to work with you from the beginning. You've been great. We appreciate all you're doing to help us with this.
Thank you as well. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you,
Larry,
everyone.
thank you.
Yes, and have a good night.